Well, thanks for joining us for this special briefing from the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm John Stonestreet, and earlier this week on the 2-Minute Warning, we talked with Jennifer Marshall, the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation, about the HHS mandate, which is something, of course, Chuck Colson talked about for the months prior to his death. He was extremely concerned about. As of August 1st, we saw the first kind of implementation of this in real time, at least for those who weren't exempt under some of the narrow exemptions. And so I've asked Jennifer to join me here for a more in-depth understanding of what the HHS mandate is and what it means for those who are concerned about issues of faith and society and religious freedom. And Jennifer's the best one that I know to do that. She heads up the Heritage Foundation think tank called the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society. Also, her website, familyfacts.org, is something that you need to put on your bookmark on your computer and go to frequently. So Jennifer, thanks so much for joining us. And please just start with a summary. What is the HHS mandate, in case there's any out there who still do not know?
Sure. Thanks, John, and thanks for drawing attention to this issue and carrying on Chuck's legacy by focusing on this important religious liberty crisis at this time. So we've actually known about the HHS mandate for about exactly 1 year. It was August 2011 when the Obama administration announced the HHS mandate under Obamacare. And this is one of the very first pieces of the implementation of this massive 2,700-page law that is now the healthcare law of the land. And that sounds massive, but it's nothing compared to the number of bureaucratic rules and regulations that are going to come down the pike. And this HHS mandate was part of one of those sets of rules called preventive services. As a part of the preventive services under Obamacare, the regulations coming out of HHS require nearly every insurance company, every insurance plan, every employer plan in the country to offer at no cost to the insured coverage for abortion, drugs, contraception, and sterilization. Now, that's regardless of any religious or moral objection, and you can imagine that a number of groups would have that. And the religious exemption was extremely narrow. It effectively covered only houses of worship, formally defined. So all kinds of Good Samaritan groups that are out there serving their communities, all kinds of small business owners that just want to run their companies according to their convictions would not be exempt under this narrow exemption. So August, that's issued. By September, all kinds of groups are weighing in. Heritage sent a letter, the National Association of Evangelicals, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Number of groups, Jewish, Mormon, and others were getting very concerned about the future of religious liberty under this mandate. By January, there was such confusion about where the administration would go with this that they felt the need to say, we're going to plow right ahead. We're going to issue the HHS final mandate with exactly those terms that we stated last August. Well, that was January 20th. And in the weeks that followed, there was such an uproar that even liberal supporters of this administration, like E.J. Dionne, who writes in the Washington Post, were saying, they may have a point. There are some religious liberty considerations here that we ought to be cautious of. And he called on the administration to perhaps reconsider. Well, on February 10th, the president called a press briefing at the White House with Secretary Sebelius of the Health and Human Services Department at his side. And he gave every indication that there was going to be some sort of a compromise, a so-called accommodation, and that they were taking seriously the religious liberty concerns that had been stated. Sadly, by the end of that day, that very day, February 10th, which was a Friday, I remember it well, the actual final regulation was entered it was put online, and a few days later entered in the Federal Register. And you know what? It was exactly the same as the August policy to begin with. So they had said one thing at noon in a press briefing and done a totally different thing at the end of the day in official policy. Well, that is now the law of the land. And that came into effect August 1st. So that is now the religious liberty trampling HHS mandate that nearly all employers in America have to deal with.
Now, there were a few exemptions, and I want to talk about that, and there was an extension that was granted to some groups as well. But before we jump in there, I want folks to understand just the gravity of this, and especially the language of it. This is really the most radical redefinition of religious liberty, at least in my opinion, that we've seen from an administration. I mean, maybe that's an overblown sort of statement, but in terms of putting into law, this is what counts as a house of worship, and no one else really applies, and so on. This is a radical redefinition of kind of a long-standing understanding of how government and nonprofits kind of work together. Is that fair enough to say?
It's a serious erosion of what we have always understood religious liberty to be. And we do not want to see a trend in federal policy that is pushing religion back into the four walls of a church or back into the privacy of a home. What this policy is indicating is that religious liberty is not something you take with you into your workplace. It is not something you take into the public square. And that is a serious, serious departure from our founders' understanding of the fullness of religious liberty. And what has made America great is that we have what's been called the prophetic voice of the church, the ability to speak out and push back against policy that does not suit conscience, that is not appropriate for our government to undertake. So that is a critically important role, and we're seeing a serious erosion of it in this HHS mandate.
When Chuck brought attention to that maybe 2.5 years ago, the difference between freedom of religion and what he called freedom of worship, I mean, I kind of thought maybe he was overstating it. But I saw just the language that the Department of Justice used recently in their defense of the mandate with this Colorado company that received one of the rare injunctions, right, the Hercules Industries. And they use that sort of language. In other words, where someone enters the business space, freedom of religion essentially is exempted, as if these things are competing freedoms. And of course, we've seen it, too, in terms of the freedom of religion and what we might call sexual freedom with this administration as well, that these two things are seen as just always colliding, and there's no compromise between the two. Is that an accurate way to put it?
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic because we hear so much about tolerance of diverse points of view, mm-hmm. and yet when it comes to a differing point of view with regard to what sexual standards should be, what should be standards with regard to these issues like abortion, drugs, and contraception, there is not a tolerance of what many understand to be a historic biblical point of view or a view about the sanctity of human life. There is an intolerance between an overreaching federal policy, in this case on health care. But you know what? We really need to be concerned about this across the board in this age of a very advanced welfare state. You see, once the federal government reaches well beyond its design, according to the founders, you've got all these ways that federal policy is pushing in on our daily lives as individuals, as families, as churches, as communities. And in all those ways, with all those tentacles, the federal government has the opportunity to start defining how it will treat different institutions of society. This is one policy under Obamacare. As I said, there are thousands and thousands of pages of rules yet to be written, and many of those will have to do with how religious employers run their health plans. How are those going to be sorted out? So this may be a fight that we have over and over and over again under Obamacare, not to mention all kinds of welfare policy and other aspects of the welfare state.
Well, and I think that was one of the concerning things that you've brought up at least a couple times about the Obamacare, aside from this particular issue, is this sort of carte blanche authority that Kathleen Sebelius or whoever is this HHS secretary kind of has to make these sorts of decisions. I mean, it's kind of like an unaccountable czar where they just put it into practice and off it goes.
Yeah, it's during the debate, what little debate there was on the congressional floors over Obamacare, it came up that there was a funding that this could possibly fund abortions. Well, out of that, that drew very serious concern from the pro-life community. That was extremely important.
Well, I think one of the things you brought up originally with Obamacare, and several other groups did, is just how much authority was given under Obamacare to the Health and Human Services Secretary to decide kind of what counts and what doesn't, and to implement it almost with czar-like autonomy.
It's really important that we recognize this kind of authority going forward in the welfare state. You know, during the little debate that was had in Congress over Obamacare before it was actually enacted, there was a lot of attention to the fact that there could be funding under this law that would go to abortions. Now, it was very alarming to those of us who are pro-life and pro-family, as rightly it should have been. What we need to recognize now going forward is that it's not just incidental funding that might go to those kinds of causes. It is the very machinery of the welfare state, the infrastructure of the welfare state that we should be concerned about, systematically colliding with issues of conscience, issues related to sexuality, issues related to abortion, issues related to religious liberty. The welfare state sets up machinery and infrastructure that goes well beyond the constitutional design for the federal government. And that creates a kind of Frankenstein that it might not be troubling you too much today, but it certainly won't prevent that from happening in the future. And in this case, it's already troubling us very much at the moment with the HHS mandate having to have gone into effect.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that Cardinal Dolan and the lawsuit that the Archdiocese of Washington D.C. has filed has kind of mentioned, and that is this quote-unquote exemption for houses of worship. What that effectively does is kind of put into law what counts as a religious institution. So as all of these other implementations are made, or the fleshing out, the details, are being fleshed out from these the other 1,800, 1,900 pages or 2,000 pages or whatever, that definition is going to move forward, and we're going to see religious freedom restricted in other areas as well.
We have no reason to expect otherwise. We certainly have a lot of reason to be concerned. One of the things that's been really great coming out of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is their very crisp articulation of the fact that we need wholehearted religious liberty, not just for, in their case, the Catholic Church, not just for Protestant churches or any other specific congregation. We need religious liberty for all kinds of religious parachurch organizations, all kinds of ministries. But beyond that, we need religious liberty protections for those who enter their workspace, for believers who go to work or who try to form businesses based on their foundational beliefs and run health plans consistent with their convictions. And it's that whole individual to institutional religious liberty that we need to be defending and promoting right now. And even people who profess no beliefs. This is critically important. As we know, religious liberty is a signal for other freedoms. So if we are seeing the state collide with religious liberty in this instance, we can be pretty sure that on down the road it's going to be colliding with all kinds of freedoms, freedom of speech in general, freedom of association in general, and you just go down the Bill of Rights from there.
Wow. Okay, so that takes us then to August the 1st, right? So August the 1st was the first deadline where folks had to comply. And specifically, there's some exemptions for religious groups, and we can talk about how narrow those exemptions, and even to qualify for an extension was pretty narrow, I think. But talk about then August 1st, someone who runs a business or who does not meet one of the exemptions, what are they required to do by the HHS mandate?
Yeah, so the policy that was finalized in February came into effect on August 1st. And what that means is that we are now in a season of impossible choices for the employers who have religious objections, moral objections to this policy. As they begin their new health plan years, and everybody's familiar with how we renew a health plan each year, it's rotating dates based on your company's plan start. When that new plan year comes up, that's when they will have to implement the HHS mandate and start offering coverage of abortion drugs, contraception, and sterilization at no cost to the people that they cover. So for many, that is, they're having to make those plans right now. We had the case of Hercules Industries, and maybe I'll go ahead and explain that one, because they were sort of the leading edge of one of the earliest planned years, beginning November 1st. And because of that, the earliest planned years of those who had filed suits, those are numbering, by the way, 58 different groups have filed suit against this mandate.
Hercules Industries is a Colorado-based HVAC company owned by the Newland family, Catholic family, very serious about their beliefs and very intentional about the way they run their company. And so because of that, they had thought very seriously about their health plan and not wanting to cover contraception or abortion drugs within it. And so they went to court, and the Alliance Defending Freedom is representing them in court. They filed for a preliminary injunction asking the judge to weigh in before August 1st because backing up from their planned start date of November 1st, they were going to have to start making those plans to either violate their conscience or pay exorbitant fines. And by the way, the fines are, if you have a non-compliant health plan, the fine is $100 per day per employee during the time of compliance. Incredible. For the Hercules Industries situation, 265 employees, that's nearly $10 million a year. What business in this struggling time can do that? The Newland family owners had a remark that, the Obama administration hasn't done a lot to build up enterprise and small business owners, but it's sure doing a lot in this mandate to tear them down. It is not respecting the freedom of these small businesses at all. So that's an example of the impossible situation that we are now in after August 1st. Violate your conscience or pay these enormous fines.
And I think one of the things that has kept too many Protestants on the fence is this idea that this is a Catholic issue. But when we're talking about violating our conscience, we're not just talking about contraception, which obviously is against many Catholics' convictions. We're talking about abortion-inducing medication. Talk a little bit about, when you say abortion drugs, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, so we're talking about the morning after pill and Ella, a drug that can work even a week after fertilization to prevent implantation and can result in an abortion. And that's critically important, that we know the specifics of what this covers. But even taking aside the specifics of the policy, what is egregious here is the violation of the religious liberty of the institutions. That government can force these religious employers to violate their conscience, take an action that is inconsistent and that goes directly against their deeply held beliefs. Today, it's these things. What will it be tomorrow on any number of issues?
Yeah. Okay, so walk us through. You've put together a set of resources at the Heritage Foundation. We'll link them at colsoncenter.org. But we need to know, as people of faith, or even people without faith, but who are concerned about this kind of overstep of the Constitution onto what many consider to be our most sacred freedom, which is the freedom of religion. What do we do?
So the first thing is to get well briefed so you can articulate this to your neighbors, to your small groups, to your church members, everywhere you go, that you can get a hearing. This is the beginning of some very, very serious erosion of our first freedom. We have resources that include a fact sheet. We have lots of profiles of the groups that have filed suit, and that's important to make sure that we understand the human face behind this, the very real victims of this policy. It's not an abstraction. It's not theoretical. It's having very significant impact, and on a number of those plaintiffs, the 58 that I mentioned that have joined more than 20 suits against this HHS mandate. I would say, too, that for organizational leaders or employers of any sort, now is the time to take a real careful look at your health plan and understand it. If you need any legal help understanding the specifics or how to go forward in a way that is consistent with your conscience, there's great legal assistance in the Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF, and the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. They are among the firms that are representing those 58 plaintiffs I mentioned. Really important to take stock of that now, and to push overall. In the final analysis, we are not going to see a resolution of this religious liberty violation under the HHS mandate until Obamacare is repealed. So ultimately, we need to be pushing for a health reform that is going to respect religious liberty, that is going to allow American employers and individuals to have freedom of choice in their health care plans so that they can find a plan that not only meets their health care needs at an affordable rate, but also matches their principles and their most foundational beliefs. And we are increasingly, through the centralization of health policy, seeing that will become an impossibility. under Obamacare, the law dictates what insurers must offer, what employers must cover, and what individuals must buy. There is no way out. And more we're going to see the absolute stifling of freedom of conscience and what would truly be freedom of choice in healthcare. And we're trading it for a very paltry idea of what should be healthcare in America.
For those businessmen, in fact, I just talked to one a couple weeks ago, just very thoughtful guy, strong in his convictions, willing to take a stand, but was really under the impression that he would be grandfathered in somehow and not be forced to honor this mandate. And that kind of gets to the heart of the exemptions. My understanding is chances are he's not grandfathered in because the exemptions are so narrow. Speak a little bit to what you know about that.
Yeah, so first of all, the number 50 is very important because the HHS mandate will apply to you if you have over 50 employees.
Okay.
Secondly, we need to understand that the HHS mandate applies to non-exempt, non-grandfathered plans. Let me run through each of those real quickly. Exempt, the religious exemption, is a very serious four-pronged definition, and basically it requires you to only hire and serve those of your own same faith, and that's why we say it effectively only covers houses of worship, formally defined. In terms of grandfathering, that's a term that's used everywhere in Obamacare to refer to a plan that, because it made no changes since the passage of Obamacare, therefore it can get out of a number of things under the law. And that's something that our policy experts here at the Heritage Foundation can help with if there's any question about that. But basically, it's a very constrictive because eventually some significant change will have to come into a health care plan. And that's what plan supervisors do all the time. That's why we have new health plan years. There are lots of changes that need to happen over time to make a plan financially workable. So grandfathering only applies if you have made no significant changes since the passage of Obamacare. And then beyond that, there is a safe harbor. Now, and even the fact that I have to list all these out points to the confusion and the murkiness that the Obama administration has brought upon us in this healthcare debate. And that's not an environment that contributes to stability and planning and longevity for ministries that are struggling at this time, businesses that are struggling at this time. So it's adding to this very serious climate of uncertainty. The safe harbor is something that some organizations can qualify for. Now, it's only nonprofit organizations, so none of the small businesses will be able to qualify. And it requires a specific warning to your employees and so on. But what it essentially allows is a 1-year extension before you have to violate your conscience. So the safe harbor kicks the can down the road a year, and by that time the administration hopes that you'll have gotten over your conscience, your foibles of conscience, and you'll be on board with the HHS mandate. So everywhere there's confusion and some very, very narrow ways that you can get out, but in the end there's going to be more and more enforcement along the lines of the HHS mandate we would expect.
Okay, just to rehash a couple groups that folks need to know about: Alliance Defending Freedom, ADF.org. We'll link to that at colsoncenter.org. The Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. Talk about give us your web address where you have at the Heritage Foundation some of this information all put together.
Yeah, sure. The Heritage Foundation website is heritage.org, and just search for HHS mandate on our search button, and you should be able to find all kinds of resources. We've covered this, like I said, since last August, and blogged in a way that we hope exposes all the ways that it is affecting real people, real businesses, real ministries, and that will give people ideas about the very people in their own lives or the organizations that they run, how they'll be affected.
Yeah, great. Jennifer Marshall is the Director of Domestic Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and thanks for helping us stay up to speed on this, and we'll get the word out as much as we can.
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate you getting the word out. This is a critical time to speak up for religious liberty in America.